Uh, in this video, we're going to go ahead and study about what OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.0 is. So let's first look into the history of authentication authorization first. So in the early days, meaning about 15 years back, uh, what just sharing information between servers was easy. So you just give username and password from one service to another so that you could log into your account and grab whatever information they wanted. So your user, that is you will just do you'll just send username and password to some client, and the client will take this username password and they will log into whatever server you have, and then they will take whatever information they wanted. So let's take an example that let's say some third party API or some third party software wants to access your bank account details. You will just give them your user ID and password. You will trust that the third party will use your username and password in uh, in in a non-nefarious way, meaning they won't do any harm to your account or they won't take money away from your account, something like that. So that was the trust that you had back then. So as you can understand that this is a very dangerous thing. So that's what we'll be going here. Yikes, you should never be able to share your username and password, your credentials to another service. So there is no guarantee that an organization will keep your credentials safe or guarantee their service won't access more of your personal information than necessary. So there's no guarantee that that third party won't do other nefarious things that you have not given permission to. It might sound crazy, but some applications still try to get away with this. So, yeah, obviously, that if you give your username and your password, a lot of applications will um, do a lot of nefarious things and they'll do a lot of bad things with your account, and they will do things that you might not expect them to do. So, today there are standards to securely allow one service to access data from another service. Let's look at those services. So the first service is OAuth 2.0. The first standard that we will be covering is the OAuth. OAuth 2.0 is a security standard where you give one application permission to access your data in another application. That's it. Very simple. OAuth 2.0 is just a security standard, just a standard where you give one application, on any third party application or any application, permission to access your data in another application. So in the example that I gave that time, the other application was your bank information. So your bank application has certain data, and you're giving, let's say, Google. Google is the third party application that is trying to access your data from the bank application. So it is trying to access your banking data from your banking application. And you are the separate entity, and you're supposed to give permission to Google to access your data from the banking application. And OAuth 2.0 is a security standard that solves this problem. So it solves the problem of securely providing information, only required information, to that application that wants to access certain information from your banking application. So let's see what OAuth 2.0 is. Instead of giving them your username and password, you can essentially give one app a key that gives them specific permission to access your data or do things on your behalf in another application. So in the old days, you're giving the third party applications your username and password and thinking that, oh, okay, I can trust these guys and these guys won't do any bad things or uh, anything that I haven't given permission for them to do. But they could do nefarious and bad things that you didn't want them to do. So in the OAuth 2.0 standard, instead of giving them the username and password, you give the app, you give the application, third party application, a key. and that key will have specific permission to access specific data or do things on behalf on your behalf in another application. So this key will only be able to access specific information. Okay, so the steps to grant permission or consent are often referred to as authorization or even delegated authorization. You authorize one application to access your data or use features in another application on your behalf without giving them your password. The steps to grant permission or consent are referred to as authorization. So, this activity of giving permission is called authorization, or it is even you can even call it delegated authorization. You authorize one application to access your data or use features in another application on your behalf without giving them your password. Very simple. What's more, you can take back that key whenever you wish. Awesome. So, this is a mechanism that's very convenient, very trustworthy, very safe for us. Yes? Let's take another example. Let's say you discovered a website named Terrible Pun of the Day. The website's name is Terrible Pun of the Day. You create an account in Terrible Pun of the Day and to send an awful pun joke as a text message every day to your phone. So what this website does is it sends a joke to your phone every day. So you went there and you created an account for yourself and you asked that application to send a joke to your phone every day. Okay? And you like this application so much that you want to share this site to everyone you have ever met online. So you want to share this site to everyone you know, all your contacts, because you want them also to enjoy this joke that's being sent to your phone every day. So who wouldn't want to read a bad one every day? Am I right? However, writing an email to every person in your contact list sounds like a lot of work. So yeah, you don't have the patience to tell every person in your contact list, oh, go check out this phone, check out this amazing website called Terrible Pun of the Day. They'll send you a joke to your phone every day. You don't have the patience to do that. And if you're like the author, you would go to great lengths to avoid doing anything that smells like hard work. Okay. So here you're saying that everyone needs bad puns. So you want bad puns, bad jokes to be sent to everyone's phone. And good thing, Terrible Pun of the Day has a feature to invite your friends. So this Terrible Pun of the Day website has a feature where you can invite your friends. Awesome. So you can go and you can access this feature. And your the next ideal thing would be that it will come and access your contacts. That's a little bit scary because your contacts are your personal information, and who knows, it might access your contacts, it might access something else also, something that you don't want it to access. So the first step to choose is to choose your email provider, and when you click on your email provider, you're redirected to your email service. Okay, so you go to Terrible Pun of the Day and you click on, so your contacts lists are in your email. Basically, in this example, your contacts lists are in your email account, whichever it might be, Gmail. You have all the list of contacts of the people, let's say. The first step is to choose your email provider. So in the Terrible Pun of the Day website, you click on your email provider. So in Terrible Pun of the Day, there'll be a list of email providers like Gmail, Outlook, Hotmail, uh, Microsoft Mail, etc., etc., Apple Mail, etc. So you go and click on Gmail, because let's say you're using Gmail. You go and click on Gmail as the email service provider. And when you click on Gmail, you're redirected. You will be sent to your Gmail account. You will be redirected to your email service. So you will be sent to your Gmail service. Then your Gmail service will check to see if you're currently logged in. So now it will first check if you're currently logged in. So when you click on Gmail on the terrible pun of the day, it will redirect you to your it will redirect you to the Gmail page, and before it displays any page, the Gmail service will check if uh, you, the person, are logged into your Gmail service or not. If you're not logged in, it will ask you to log in. And if you're already logged in, uh, you will be presented with a question. Do you want to give terrible pun of the day access to your contacts? So that Gmail service will specifically tell you, specifically ask you if you want to give terrible pun of the day access to the contacts that you have stored in your Gmail account. So assuming that you haven't changed your mind, you click allow. You'll say yellow, you'll say allow. Yeah, please allow terrible pun of the day to access uh, my accounts on my Gmail service. Now, once you click allow, you'll be redirected back to terriblepunoftheday.com, and a thank you page will be open, and it'll say, okay, thank you very much for allowing uh, the terrible pun of the day to access your contacts. Now we can read your contacts, and once it reads the contacts, you can give it further permission to send an email, or to send all your contacts information about terrible pun of the day. And that is the only thing it can do. Terrible pun of the day can now send emails to everyone you know, and you will be the most popular person ever. OAuth for the win. So this is what happens on a surface level. So this is what you see when you click on the screen, and uh, once you give permissions. So how these permissions are given, how Gmail provides these services, these permissions, and ensures security, how Gmail ensures that terrible pun of the day is only reading your contacts and it's not reading anything else, it's not reading your mails or anything like that. That we will see next. That are the inner details of how OAuth works and how it segregates permissions. So let's go through the OAuth 2.0 flow. So you just step through what is commonly referred to as OAuth flow. The OAuth flow in this example is made up of visible steps to grant consent, as well as some invisible steps where the two services agree on a secure way of exchanging information. The previous terrible pun of the day example uses the most common OAuth 2.0 flow known as the authorization code flow. So the previous terrible pun of the day example uses the most common OAuth 2.0 flow known as the authorization code flow. So OAuth 2.0 terminology is resource owner. That is you. You are the resource owner. Let's step through the terminologies. That we'll go through all the terminologies, and then we'll try to uh, code flow through. We'll try to flow through our previous example by mentioning what each and every resource entity, or each and every entity in our OAuth 2.0 behaves, and how it services the permissions. So the first one is resource owner. That is you. You are the resource owner. You are the owner of your identity, your data, and any actions that can be performed with your accounts. Uh, so I am the resource owner in this case. So that particular uh, terrible pun of the day service wants to access resources that are owned by me. Hence, I am the resource owner. The next one is client. The client is the application in our example, terrible pun of the day, that wants to access data or perform actions on behalf of you, the resource owner. So terrible pun of the day is the client here. It wants to access my contacts, and it wants to perform actions, that is send information to all my contacts on behalf of me. So uh, on behalf of the resource owner, which is me. So client is terrible pun of the day. Authorization server. The authorization server is the application that knows the resource owner, where the resource owner already has an account. So let's go through this again. The authorization server is the application that knows the resource owner, where the resource owner already has an account. So in this case, the authorization server is the Gmail service, because it is the application that knows me, it knows Abhinav, and it knows where all my Gmail contacts are, and it also knows that I have an account with Gmail. So here, authorization is server is the server that will allow the client to access my details. So we'll go into that next. Resource server is also the Gmail service. The resource server is the application programming interface or API or service the client wants to use on behalf of the resource owner. So I think the sentence is very clear. The resource service is an API. Gmail can act as an API uh, uh, that the client wants to use. So the client, terrible pun of the day, it wants to use uh, my Gmail services, my Gmail resources. Uh, so it accesses my Gmail resources through the resource servers API, uh, and it is using my resources on behalf of me. Simple. Sometimes the authorization server and the resource server are the same server. However, there are cases where they will not be the same server or even part of the same organization. So in this case, the resource server and the authorization server are the same, which is the Gmail service. But you can have cases where a separate application will do the authorization, a separate application will store the resources. The authorization server may be part of the same service the resource server trusts. Notice that the authorization service must be trusted by the resource server. Redirect URI. This is the URI the authorization server will redirect the resources owner back to after granting permission to the client. This is sometimes referred to as the callback URL. Redirect URI. So this is the URL the authorization server will redirect the resource owner back to after granting permission to the client. This is sometimes referred to as the callback URL. So after granting permission to the client, meaning that after allowing terrible pun of the day to, after giving that permission to access your contacts in that the resource owner holds, the authorization server will tell the resource owner to go to a particular URI, which is also known as the redirect URI. This URI is where uh, this is where terrible pun of the day will receive information that it asked for. So this is the URL the authorization server will redirect the resource owner back to after granting permission to the client. So after granting permission, the meeting point where the resource owner and the client meet is the redirect URI. Understood? This is where the resource owner and the client, which is the terrible pun of the day, meet. Resource type, the type of information the client expects to receive. Okay, so here the resource type is, let's say, a list of contacts. So the resource type would be something like JSON information. Uh, so the most common type, response type is code, where the client expects to receive an authorization. Okay. Um, so response type is the first type of response that the authorization server sends to the client uh, during authentication or after during authorization or just after authorization. So this type of information client expects to receive. Type of information the client expects to receive. The most common response type is code, where the client expects to receive an authorization code. So uh, the response type is an authorization code generally. The next one is scope. These are the granular permissions the client wants, such as access to data or to perform actions. Scopes will be something like you will give a very specific scope uh, that the client can access. Something like read contacts will be a particular scope. So if you give the scope as read contacts, the client can only read contacts. Or if you give the scope as read email number 1623, then the scope of access for the client will be that it can only read information of email number 1623 or something like that. The next one is consent. Authorization server takes the scopes the client is requesting and verifies the resource owner whether or not they want to give the client permission. So once the client sends a request, the request will contain the scopes that it wants to access. So the scopes might be like contacts or information in email, in a certain email, something like that. So once the authorization server receives this request from the client, and it verifies with the resource owner. So once the authorization server receives a request from the client, that authorization server will come to you, the resource owner, and it will ask whether or not you want to give the client permission to access these scopes. So in our previous example, the authorization server, which is Gmail, came to you and asked you whether you want to give access to terrible pun of the day, or if you want to give access to your contacts to terrible pun of the day. So that is consent. So that part is the consent. The next one is client ID. This ID is used to identify the client with the authorization server. Uh, so client ID is used to identify the client with the authorization server. Very simple. Client secret. This is a secret password that only the client and authorization server know. This allows them to securely share information privately behind the scenes. So let's look at client ID again. So this terrible pun of the day will be assigned something like an ID. It will be assigned an ID which is called client ID. As for now, that much is enough. Uh, the next one is client secret. So client secret is a secret password that only the client and the authorization server knows. So when uh, when authorization server and the client, terrible pun of the day, when they are exchanging information, there will be something. Uh, they will be sharing a certain secret, which is known as the client secret. This will allow them to securely share information privately behind the scenes. So that's what is client secret. It's a secret password that allows the client and the authorization server to securely share information privately behind the scenes. That's what is client secret. The next one is authorization code. This is a short-lived temporary code that the authorization server sends back to the client The client then privately sends the authorization code back to the authorization server along with the client secret in exchange for an access token. Okay, so uh, how does this authorization server give permission to the client once the user has consented to giving access? So what the authorization server does is it sends a short-lived temporary code. So it generates a short-lived temporary code that the authorization server sends back to the client, and the client sends back the authorization code back to the authorization server along with the client secret in exchange for an access token. So first step would be authorization code generated by the authorization server. Second step, authorization code short-lived. The authorization code is a short-lived temporary code. This authorization code is then sent to the client. Now the client sends the authorization code and the client secret. So client secret is again a secret password to the authorization server. So in step 3, the client sends two things, which is the authorization code and the client secret to the uh, to the authorization server. So yeah, to the authorization server. And once the authorization server has received the correct client secret and the correct authorization code, it then sends it then sends an access token back to the client. Now the client has an access token, and with this access token, let's see what it can do. An access token is the key the client will use from that point forward to communicate with the resource server. This is like a key or a key card that gives the client permission to request data or perform actions with the resource server on your behalf. So once it gets the access token is basically the key that it can use on the resource server to access particular information. Very simple. Once it has this key, it'll access whatever information it wants, provided that information is in the scope of the key. And it'll do this on your behalf. Next. So let's revisit this flow. Let's revisit with the terminologies that we have learned. Let's revisit the entire flow of the terrible pun of the day example. So you, the resource owner, want to client to access your contacts so that they can send invitations to all your friends. The client redirects your browser to all your friends. Just a second. Let's revisit the example from the beginning uh, with the terminologies that we have learned. So, you, the resource owner, want to allow the terrible pun of the day client they can send invitations to all your friends. So, you're the resource owner and you want to allow terrible pun of the day to access your Gmail. So, that terrible pun of the day can access your contacts, and terrible pun of the day will send invitations to all your friends in your contacts. Okay, so that's the goal. The the first step would be that the client redirects your browser to the authorization server. So once you click on your uh, Gmail service on the terrible pun of the day website, uh, the client, which is terrible pun of the day, will redirect your browser to the authorization server. So terrible pun of the day will redirect you to your Gmail service. And when it is redirecting you to the Gmail service, it sends its request, it sends its client ID, it sends the redirect URI, which is the URI that the resource server will redirect itself to once permission is granted. It will send the response type, and it will send the scope of access that it needs. Scope here is the contact. Excuse me. It wants to access contacts. So the next step would be the authorization server verifies who you are and if necessary prompts for a login. The authorization server then presents you with a consent form. The authorization server uh, verifies who you are. So how does the authorization server verify who you are? If you're already logged in, it will know that, okay, Abhinav is already logged in. So uh, it is Abhinav that is asking the client to uh, access his contact information. If it is not you, if you're not already logged in, the authorization server, which is your Gmail service, will ask you to provide your login ID and password. So once you enter your login ID and password, the authorization service, which is Gmail, will know that, okay, it is Abhinav who has logged in, and it is Abhinav that is asking Terrible Pun of the Day to access his contacts. So I can give permission to Terrible Pun of the Day to access his contacts. Um, so that's what it's being stated here. The authorization server verifies who you are and, if necessary, prompts for a login for the prompts for a login. The authorization server then presents you with a consent form based on the scopes requested by the client. So once it knows that it is Abhinav who has logged in, the Gmail service will present a consent form. So it will ask, are you sure you want to allow Terrible Pun of the Day to access your contacts? And there'll be an allow decline button. So if you want to grant permission, you click on the allow button. If you want to deny permission, you click on deny permission. So there you have the opportunity to grant or deny the permission. The authorization server then redirects back to the client using the redirect URI. So once you've given the permission, the authorization server will redirect the client. The client here is Terrible Pun of the Day. It will redirect Terrible Pun of the Day. It will redirect to Terrible Pun of the Day using the redirect URI that was provided by Terrible Pun of the Day, along with temporary authorization code. So there'll be a temporary authorization code generated on the authorization server side. So this temporary authorization code will be sent to uh, this temporary authorization code will be sent to the client. Then the client contacts the authorization server directly. It does not use the resource owner's browser and securely sends. So on the back end, the client will communicate with the authorization server, and it will send its client ID, client secret, and the authorization code. So it'll send these three things, and the authorization code, remember, was sent in the previous step by the authorization server. So the authorization code is a temporary code that is generated, temporary short-lived code that is generated by the authorization server. Uh, so it doesn't. So on the backend, the client communicates with the authorization server, and it securely sends its client ID, client secret, and the authorization code. The authorization server verifies these three things that the client has sent, which is the client ID, client secret, and the authorization code. And if they're correct, it responds with an access token. Once the three uh, once the three codes are verified, the authorization server sends an access token. So this access token is a key which the client will use on the resource server to access whatever resources it wants. The access token is a value the client doesn't understand. So when the access token is received by the client, doesn't understand the client, the access token will all be gibberish. So as far as the client is concerned, the access token is just a string of gibberish. However, the client can use the access token to send requests to the resource server. So it can use this key. So you don't. So once it receives the key, you don't know uh, exactly how the key is made, or uh, what components of the key makes it special that it'll access only a certain kind of resource from the resource server. The client doesn't know that. So it just knows that it has a key, and it'll this key will only be able to open resources that uh, the resource owner has given it permissions for. So in this case, the permissions are only contacts. So this key will only open up contacts of Abhinav PY. Uh, the client is like, here's an access token. I would like the contacts associated with the resource owner of this token. The resource server verifies the access token, and if it is valid, responds with the contacts requested. So it if the access token is correct, it responds with the contacts that are requested by the client. That's it. So here's another paragraph. So it's also important to know before you gave terrible pun of the day permission to access client and the authorization server already established a working relationship. So the client and the authorization server were already in a working relationship even before you gave terrible pun of the day access to your contacts. The authorization server generated a client ID and client secret, sometimes called. So the authorization server, if you remember, they had already generated a client ID and a client secret that it had sent to the client, and it and gave them to the client to use for all future OAuth exchanges. As the name implies, the client's secret must be kept secret so that only the client and the authorization server know what it is. So even before uh, even before you gave the client access to uh, access and permission to access your contacts, the client and the authorization server already had a working relationship. So how do we know they already had a working relationship? We know because the authorization server had already generated a client ID and a client secret and had sent it to the client, so that whenever it wants to uh, grant the client permissions to anything, the client would have to send the client secret and the client ID along with the temporarily generated authorization code back to the authorization server to verify that it is the client that is uh, getting access to the resource information that the resource provider is providing. That the resource provider has given permission to access. And again, the client secret must be kept secret. It is a secret so that only the client and the authorization server know what it is. So this is how the authorization server can verify the client. The client and the authorization server must have something in secret so that the authorization server knows that, okay, this client is a trusted client and I've worked with him before. I know that this client will not misuse the information or something like that. Uh, so this trust is maintained by the client secret. The client secret is a code that basically is a trust between the authorization server and the client. So that's all for OAuth 2.0.